So without further ado, I bring you Jerry.
Let me just begin by talking a little bit about the background and history of Workers' World Party, and then which will be kind of a way to go into what is a revolutionary party and what is the importance of building a revolutionary party. Workers' World Party was founded in 1959, and at that time Workers' World was a split from the Socialist Workers' Party, though the leadership of Workers' World Party had been grouping within the Socialist Workers, kind of an independent grouping, for approximately 10 years, at least 10 years before that. The split was the SWP was fundamentally around the conception of a global class struggle, where our comrades viewed that and fundamentally what it devolved around was the SWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, as many of the Trotskyist organizations at that time and worldwide since, even though we come out of that orientation ourselves, but had abandoned the Soviet Union and had abandoned virtually the whole socialist camp, and especially when the Chinese Revolution happened in 1949, refused to recognize the Chinese Revolution as a socialist revolution and as a tremendous step forward, even though it was a revolution where a revolutionary party in China brought communism to 1 billion people. And so the differences had matured over many years, but I think in many ways what was at the core of them was our view of the global class struggle, and especially our defense of all the worker states and socialist countries with all the various ups and downs that existed within them, but recognizing that they represented a new class formation in the process of overturning imperialism and capitalism. Our branch was founded in Detroit in 1970. And in 1970, Workers' World about tripled in size in about a year's time. And it tripled in size by bringing in collectives like ourselves. We were like a grouping that was among the leaders of the Students for Democratic Society at U of M campus. And SDS by the late 60s, you don't hear about this too much. They talk about the more liberal background of SDS with Tom Hayden and them. By the late 60s, SDS by and large was a revolutionary organization. It constituted kind of the revolutionary wing of the anti-war movement, was thoroughly anti-capitalist, and had and there were collectives out of SDS that as student radicals began seeing that you weren't going to make a revolution on the campus, that you had to go into the working class and the communities, collectives developed and went into different cities. And at that time, Workers' World had a youth group, Youth Against War and Fascism, that was within the militant wing of the anti-war movement, was really about the only party that participated in the militant wing. And back then, when I talk about the militant wing, it was like a kind of a more establishment wing led a lot by the CP and the SWP, Communist Party, and Socialist Workers' Party, and a lot of moderate pacifist groups that tended to emphasize one-issue politics, bring the troops home, where there was an anti-imperialist wing to the movement that viewed the fight against the Vietnam War as not just a question of opposing war, but opposing the system that was behind the war and opposing U.S. imperialism, and linking the fight against imperialist war to the fight of oppressed nations right in the U.S. who were rebelling in the Black nation and the Puerto Rican nation, to linking those struggles up. And Workers' World was among the parties that reached out to this revolutionary youth wing and brought us, and we joined, we affiliated, and there were collectives around the country that joined Workers' World as groups, looking, because we began recognizing the need for a revolutionary party, that we had to go beyond just being a collective, and that's how we came in, and the party actually tripled in size, and it's a good lesson for history that in a period of struggle, a revolutionary party will become a beacon for those who are looking to go beyond the day-to-day struggle, to go beyond, to find a vehicle to challenge capitalism in the system. And that's how we came into the system, and we've been active in Workers' World ever since, and had in many struggles, a lot of which will be talked about today. We've even participated in bourgeois elections from a revolutionary point of view, and held ballot status in Michigan for a number of years. But we've always understood the importance of building a party. I kind of disagree with Debbie. I think part of why the attendance is a little lower today is right now the struggle is so intense lately, where there's so many actions going on, whether it's around the water or different, that people, right now there's an activist, and people are so involved in the day-to-day struggle that sometimes it's hard to step back from it, to take the time to review ideology. But we felt it's important to do that, and that's why we're having this conference. And we are very involved in the struggle in Detroit right now, but at the same time, we understand why that to stay in the struggle, we have to take the time to study our ideological roots, to renew ourselves, because that's what keeps you in the struggle. You know, the seminal book, work on kind of building a revolutionary Leninist party, was written by V.I. Lenin in 1902, and the book was called What Is to Be Done. And we haven't studied it in our classes yet, but we should, looking it over again, because in many ways it articulates the conception of a Marxist-Leninist party that we feel is still valid today, and which we believe is kind of at the root of our organizational being. Lenin, in What Is to Be Done, kind of talked about how the masses of people, the working class and oppressed, always find ways to resist. People will fight. You know, sometimes we get a little frustrated in this country because the struggle tends to mature slowly, but you do see the manifestations of struggle. Just think in the last few years, and what we see is still somewhat of a dead period. What we've seen, we saw the Occupy movement develop all over the country. And what was the Occupy? And it was outgrowth from Wisconsin, really, from the workers in Wisconsin finding a way, occupying the Capitol, the workers and the youth, occupying the Capitol in response to right-wing reaction. And we saw the Occupy movement in many ways as a manifestation of youth who have no future in the system, looking of a way to organize themselves to fight back. And it was really part of an international movement. Think about it in Tunisia and Egypt, where there were similar occupations of people that were fighting against both the lack of democratic rights, but also at the root of it was the ravages of capitalist austerity that's going on all over the world. And you saw the manifestation of the in the Occupy movement. We've seen in the last couple of years the development of a low-wage movement, the D15 movement, where workers are fighting as part of the lowering of wages, which is endemic to capitalism in this era, based on the globalization in the hands of the capitalist class, which now can pit workers in the U.S. against workers all over the globe. They're able to, suddenly a U.S. worker doesn't have the privileged position they once had, at least the sector. They're seen as competing not just with their fellow workers in the U.S., but competing with workers in India and Mexico and everywhere around the world, because technology has given them a way to do just-in-time production on an international scale. And in response to this lowering of wages, which is part of the dynamic of capitalism explained by Marx, how technology leads to a lowering of wages because the capitalists try to make up for the decline in the rate of profit that results. We're now seeing the D15 movement for the first time, the responses to it, and low-wage workers are organizing, and whether it's in McDonald's or fast food workers, but we're seeing it all over the country, struggles developing of low-wage workers. And of course, we just saw in the last week and a half, the tremendous uprising in Ferguson, Missouri. And what was that? That was a response to the racist and naked police brutality that goes on every day in the oppressed community that hit a boiling point in Ferguson. And you can't help but look at the people, and every day they're out there night after night in the face of military occupation, a blatant military. They can't slow it down. People come out. They try to say it's slowed down, but I saw last night you could just see people marching every night. And you can imagine in St. Louis, it's probably about 95 degrees. St. Louis is a hot city, but people are out. And they're not just out there kind of organizing themselves, distributing food, trying to take it on. And there was a response. And Lenin described this. He talked about the spontaneity of the masses. In other words, the masses of people will find a way to fight, and do fight historically, in different forms. But the limitation in the spontaneity of the masses is how to take those struggles beyond the limitations imposed on them by the system and by the ideology of the system. And what has to be done? Lenin talked about how the dominant ideology of any system is the ideology of the ruling class, because that's what we're imbued with, right? We're imbued with. And that even in the struggles, when workers find a way to organize, it's hard. The question is how to get those individual struggles to transcend the limitations placed on them by the bourgeois ideology, to take them beyond the limits of fighting within the confines of capitalism and reform and the limits of the system, to raising them to a challenge against the system as a whole, which is really at the root of every one of the struggles. And that's really what the role of a party is. Lenin talked about how trade union consciousness, which is really what he talked about, is the consciousness of fighting back. That comes spontaneously, but the consciousness of challenging the whole system, of taking that struggle from a struggle to reform or that stays within the confines of the system into a challenge of the system, has to be, what he described, has to be brought from outside. And what he meant by that is that requires conscious revolutionaries who've been able to break with the ideological limits imposed on every one of us by living in this system, and that's what a revolutionary party is about. That the role of a party, obviously we don't stand apart from the struggle, we're in every struggle, and we're with the masses in every struggle. But what separates a party and a communist is that the communist brings into those struggles the consciousness that at the root of oppression, whether it's national oppression or low wages or the austerity that we've been fighting here, is the system we live under, it's capitalism. And that ultimately, the only way to transcend that oppression is by overthrowing the whole system. And that's what a party is about. That the party is fundamentally an ideological formation, but it's tied to the combat of the working class, but brings into that combat the consciousness of overthrowing the system. And that's really what the root of it, and that takes a revolutionary party. Because it's hard to sustain. When I joined the party, there were a lot of youth, there were a lot of revolutionary youth, and a lot of them are still active. A lot of them are still active. But in terms of raising revolutionary politics, people tend to dissipate over the years. You get involved in your union, or you get involved in a community struggle, or you get involved in, Latin America solidarity, every struggle. But those struggles aren't a substitute for a challenge to the system. And that's what a party is about. A party is a formation, is what we call a vanguard formation, that can bring together the most advanced elements, those elements that are ready to take that struggle to another level and bring us together. And you can't do that by yourself. You can't. Because each one of us, we need the support of each other. We need the discipline of each other. We need the lessons that we all share with each other to take that struggle in, so to overcome the bourgeois pressure that's on every one of us, everyone who lives in this society. That's what a revolutionary party is about. And that's what the Leninist conception is. And it's a combat party. I want to make clear, when I talk about that we're an ideological formation, Marx always taught that knowledge has two parts to it. It's theory and practice. We don't just sit around to read, to study the ideas. A party takes those ideas of how to challenge the system and gives life to them in the day-to-day struggle. And we intervene in the struggle, but we intervene from our ideological perspective. And that's really what separates our participation in the struggle and from other individuals, and that's why you need an organization like this. That's why in the midst of right now, we're in Detroit, where every day there are protests, and whether it's the international struggle with Gaza, or the police brutality struggle, and also the bankruptcy question that's coming to a hill, we felt it was important to take a couple days to reaffirm ourselves, to reaffirm our ideology. And I think really why there aren't more people here, it's a lot of people out there running right now, but in the midst of that running, which sustains our ability to run, so we're not just running helter-skelter, is studying, is coming together to renew and review our ideological perspective, which we take in. I just want to end by saying, in Detroit, we've been in a profound struggle for really the last 2 years, where Detroit is an African-American city, is a city that's among the hardest hit cities by all the different aspects of capitalist oppression, from the restructuring of industry to the predatory lending that the banks impose on oppressed communities all over the country, really on the working class as a whole, but especially on oppressed communities, and to the austerity which means where the banks impose conditions on countries, on states, and on cities to make sure that their bonds get paid at the expense of the working class. Detroit's become kind of a center for that, with the imposition of an emergency manager that took actually control. Our elected officials really don't even have power in the city. We're run by a dictator put in by the banks, essentially. And we're in the midst now of a bankruptcy, the biggest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the U.S. And really what the bankruptcy is an attempt to restructure the entire city on behalf of the creditors, on behalf of the banks and big business, to make sure that they come paramount and to sacrifice whatever it takes to sacrifice, which means workers' pensions, which means unions are being busted, which means the basic right to water is being denied to thousands of people. That's what we're fighting right now, and it's a tough struggle. When the struggle started in Detroit, there were a lot of protests, like always. It wasn't like people just sat back and said, we're going to let them take over our city. And there were big demonstrations. The biggest rally was a couple years ago. There was a rally of 2,000 people in a church. There was a petition campaign. They got hundreds of thousands of petitions and actually overturned the law that put the emergency manager in a referendum. There was a successful referendum where a lot of resources and effort went into the petitioning and into making the referendum succeed. But what happened was the state just, in the arrogance, kind of like what happened in Wisconsin, you overturn a law and they come in and just repass it the next day. They reimpose the emergency manager. But so the struggle for a long time took the form, because the ostensible form of the struggle was a struggle for democratic rights. And it was, and that was a major thing. We were talking about disenfranchising a black city. And Detroit was one of the first major cities to have a black mayor and a black administration. It had a history of kind of almost a progressive social democratic leadership. And so certainly the struggle, the manifestation of the struggle and the resistance to the struggle was in the form of a resistance to defend the democratic right to vote, the democratic right to choose our own officials. But we almost alone recognize that the real fight in Detroit, beyond that, and that's not to say that wasn't at the core of it, but even beyond that, what was moving that forward was finance capital. Was that the banks, that the emergency manager bill contained language in it that an emergency manager could break every union, but it had to pay off the bondholders that they were guaranteed under. And we from day one recognized that what was at the root of the struggle was not just a struggle for democratic rights, but was a struggle against capitalist austerity and against the capitalist system and finance capital that in this period was more directly imposing its will on the workers in Detroit, just as they're doing in Greece, just as the IMF did to Latin America for years, just as they're doing in Portugal, just as they're doing in Spain, just as they're doing in Puerto Rico right now, that we were part of this international fight, and we were kind of the focal point of this international austerity being imposed upon the working class by finance capital in this era, in this more direct rule of finance capital in the banks, in the financial institutions, the direct control they wanted over the economy. And from day one, we became really the only voice in Detroit that started saying, look, we got to get beyond the form of the struggle and get to the core of the struggle. And we did a FOIA. We got all the documents, the bond documents. And most of us had never read a bond document in our lives, but we started studying them and understanding them and reading up on them and talking to people around the country who could help us get it. And we became kind of the voice in the struggle to say, look, we got to get past just democratic rights. What happened in Detroit was in the effort to avoid the emergency manager, the elected officials began mimicking what the emergency manager was going to do. So even before the emergency manager came in, they started giving up one asset after another, imposing wage cuts on the workers. And the unions, in an effort to try to, because they saw the struggles within kind of a limited framework, went along with it, as we see happens in many struggles, where the unions don't feel a perspective, that if you don't have a perspective to challenge the system, what do? You try to get the best you can out of the system. And that's what was happening here. And in many ways it undermined the struggle for a long period of time. But we developed a role in the struggle as the voice that's kept talking about the banks. So whenever there was a rally, we became the people got up and put the finger on the banks. And as the struggle evolved in Detroit, more and more it became clear to people that what's really at the root of the struggle is finance capital of the banks. And we learned a lot in it. We played a major role in it. We actually set back the banks in some aspects of it by raising our banners. Were at every demonstration where people would have demonstrations denouncing the emergency manager, we would also have banners saying cancel the debt, take it from the banks, not the workers. And we gave voice to that aspect of the struggle. Unfortunately, as I said, in every struggle, there's a fight between the revolutionary elements, who really, and we're not a big party right now. We have a pretty strong branch, but we're still not big. And so what happened was, because the other organizations, and particularly the union movement, didn't take that perspective, even though they were very aware of what these attacks were, and they were insulted by them. I really feel that. Because they were insulting what they're doing. I mean, the idea that you're going against, that every retiree in Detroit is taking cuts that amount to pretty close to 20%, losing most of their health benefits. It's devastating. But the unions who represent the people said, well, that's the best we can do right now. And they went along with it. And we on a weekly basis were organizing, and we developed a group of militant workers, rank and file workers, people who've never been in the struggle, who were strong enough to stand up to this challenge, but we didn't contribute. But we were still, our limitation was on the limitation of the revolutionary movement to fight it back. And right now, what we're seeing in Detroit is pretty severe cuts being imposed on the working class. At the same time, though, the role of the banks have been exposed in the city. And all over now in rallies, people talk about the banks, they talk about the swaps, they talk, what we raised and when we were the only voice, it's being echoed. And we have every confidence that even though this current bankruptcy is going to take a pretty big toll on the working class here, that it's going to be one step in the overall struggle. And that the consciousness has been risen, has grown. And it really, it's been our role to raise that consciousness to prepare for this, to bring it into the struggle that exists now and prepare for the struggles to come. So I'll end there and say that this is an era we live under where, I mean, think what happened to Occupy. As great as Occupy was, everywhere, it dissipated after a year or two. And it wasn't because the people weren't determined, and it wasn't because, and I'm not just talking about the U.S., look at Tunisia, look at what's happened in Egypt, but what was missing was a revolutionary party, you see. What was missing were revolutionaries who can go into that struggle and solidarize with it and say, come on, now let's take it to another level. Let's take it to another level. Let's not just hold on to some land, let's talk about occupying the system. Let's look at what's behind us. And in fact, when Occupy moved in the direction, the capitalist system moved pretty heavily against it in this country too, orchestrated by the Obama administration and Homeland Security. But they weren't ready for that attack because they saw themselves as kind of occupying a section of within the capitalist system. But when it started getting a little too militant, it became intolerable for the system and became crushed. And not just here, but that's a worldwide phenomenon. I think what this period has shown, that for the struggle to move forward, it has to be anti-capitalist. It has to rise to a fight against the system. And as Lenin pointed out, and what has been done, that's the role of a party. And we may be not a big party right now, but we're going to grow because it has to happen. Revolutionary organization, and building revolutionary organization, to me, is a critical factor in the next period. Because as we've seen in Ferguson, the fights are coming, rebellions are coming, you know, and it ain't limited. That's a small town, think about it. That's in a small town like that, these 20,000 people, you can have a pretty backward town with 3 black cops, imagine. But people are fighting. People have never probably had exposure to struggle are out there, they understand it. People are gonna fight, but for that fight to mean something, it's gotta become not just a fight over an issue, or not just a fight over a particular outrage, but a fight against the system. This system reeks. Capitalism is overripe, you know, for revolution. You know, so look at it. They can't give water in the Great Lakes state, a state surrounded by more fresh water than any other state. They're denying water to the people. They can't even give water. We had a conference last week on hunger, a great conference. They can't feed the people. You know, the richest country in the world with all this technology can't meet any of the necessity. Capitalism is overripe. Socialism is overripe. We need socialism yesterday because socialism can rebuild the society on a rational basis by eliminating the capitalists. But the vehicle to that is a building a party. That's why we're meeting today. That's why it's worth taking this time. That's why I think it's so important. That's why the people here, we'll take it. We'll get more. We don't even worry about that. There are people out there that are ready. The problem isn't that people aren't ready to hear our message. They're waiting to hear our message. We got to get out to them. You know, we were at a conference last week, an academic conference. People weren't hesitant to hear that the problem is capitalism. They cheered when they heard it. People are ready for us. Don't think I don't agree that people aren't ready to hear about it. They're ready. We got to build those, but we got to empower a cadre that can take that message in a living way to the masses. That's what the party's about. That's why the Bolsheviks won. The Bolsheviks won in Russia because they built a revolutionary party, where the rest of Europe with all the big social democratic parties couldn't rise to the occasion. Let's build a revolutionary party. Let's strengthen ourselves ideologically. Our time is going to come, and let's build that revolution and make it happen.